It's nice to see so many people turn out to our third merger meeting. Whilst we've got you out, I'd just like to take the opportunity to do a quick Federation update before I hand over to all of our speakers. We've got our AGM at the end of next month, so I think it might be a useful opportunity just to give you a bit of further feedback about what's been happening with the Federation for the last 12 months. Firstly, can I apologise? At our last AGM, we said that we were going to have quarterly update meetings, and that hasn't happened. The reason for that is because we've had quite a few merger meetings and we really didn't want to impose on any more of your time. So I do apologise for that and do recognise that we do need to have regular communication and meetings in the future. Okay, so just a quick recap on our current contracts. It's a bit small. Extended hours. As you know, we had an extension to our extended hours contract to the end of January. And we're working on negotiations for that going forward. Barrier House contract is still in place until April 2020. GP and A&E, septomy service I've put on there, but obviously we've just had notice of that to end. Community hospitals, Timberdyne contract, Alliance Board, medicines optimisation in care homes, our enhanced services, and of course our support practices. So just to give you an idea of our performance for the last 12 months, we actually made a profit for the first time, which is great news. The profit came out at 430,000. That's largely due to the fact that we capitalised the extended hours income. So we had a Prime Minister's Challenge Fund pot of £1.8 million. We didn't use all of it. So in our previous sets of accounts, we didn't capitalise it because it was still in our coffers waiting for a service to be delivered. So we couldn't capitalise it until the end of that contract period. So it was the ideal opportunity to do it last year, which puts us in a profitable position. Core business is still profitable. So you'll recall that all of those services that I've just talked about, with the exception of Barrier House, have always given us a little bit of profit as well. Barrier House is continuing to make a loss, but in the last 12 months we've worked really, really hard to try and turn that around. We've used a lot of the extended hours income to try and add income into that big part of the business so that we don't make a loss. Our forecast for this year is that there'll be £50,000 loss at the end of the year, which is a great result considering that it's been sort of nearly 200,000 in the previous years. We were challenged previously at AGMs about why we're still holding on to the contract, and we did have a meeting with the CCG about whether we should hand the contract back. And that was the point that they pointed out to us that there was no break clause in the contract. So we're stuck with it until April 2020. But they do recognise that it's making a loss, and we are talking to them about ways they can help us to try and reduce that, the difference. One of the things that we've done this year is to look at how we deal with it in the accounts, basically. So there's something called an onerous contract, so when you know that you're going to make a loss on something, you make provision for it, and we've made provision for it in this year's accounts. Obviously, as we've made a profit this year, one of the things that we talk about at every AGM is whether we pay dividends to our shareholders, and you'll be well aware that in the last 2 years we've asked you to vote for the fact that they'll have something that says we're not going to pay dividends. At our AGM next month, obviously this question is going to come up again in a quite different stance because we have made a profit this year. But I want to make you aware of what the future holds for us. So there are a number of threats that we're facing at the moment. The septomy service contract ended on the 30th of September. Now that only made us a very small profit in the last 12 months, £1,270. But obviously that's been really important to the two factors that provide it because that was income that they're going to now lose. The community hospitals contract we've been given notice of, so we'll only have that contract until the end of March 2018. The profit for that contract was £60,000 a year, so that's going to be a considerable blow to us next year. We're already forecasting how that's going to impact us. Following that, Timberdyne is a different contract to community hospitals, so we thought the Timberdyne contract was safe, but a couple of weeks ago we had notice on the Timberdyne contract as well, so that will end in September 2018. So that's really disappointing news for us, and I think we took it particularly badly because we feel that it's something that as an Alliance board, those are the types of services that we should be jointly providing with the Housing and Care Trust. So it was a bit of a blow to us that they made a decision to take the contract away from us and to go out to direct procurement on it. And we've made our feelings known on that. The final thing that I need to say is that the extended hours contract's not yet been awarded to us, so we've had the extension until the end of January next year, but we're still negotiating the contract going forward. So we've had some conversations with the CCG, some of which have been positive, some not so positive, and we're still not at a point yet whether we can say that that's going to be a contract going forward, unfortunately. There has been an indication, and I know that there's a paper going to the Primary Care Commissioning Group next week, to say that they'll recommend giving us the contract, but what that contract will look like is a different matter. So news yet to come on that, but it's definitely not a given that we'll get the contract longer term. So with all of those things in mind, we need to be really careful about what we do with that profit that we've got. The profit won't see us through the whole year, and that would then bring us on to the question about whether we're sustainable as a federation and whether we need to look to people for subscriptions if we wanted to continue going. The other thing that I just wanted to mention, which is not on the slide, is the A&E contract. So some of you may be aware that there's been a paper released recently called Primary Care Streaming, and that's to look at how A&E deal with patients walking through the door that shouldn't actually be there. So we've been working closely with A&E on what to do to try and put this, to implement this. Their view is very much that we already provide primary care screening in A&E because we've got GPs there, but that's not quite the national view. So we're still talking about what that looks like. And then a few weeks ago we also had another paper which was commissioned around urgent treatment centres, which you've probably all heard about. So there's a little bit of uncertainty there as well. It looks like Worcester might be an urgent treatment centre, and how that will affect us in our GP capacity there and how primary care wants to be screened from A&E. We just simply don't know the answers to that yet. So there's lots of bad news there, I'm afraid, and it's not looking healthy for us in terms of profitability for the next year. So what does that present to us in terms of opportunities? Well, I think it's an opportunity to review our cost base. So we need to particularly look at our staff and premises costs. And sort of following on from that, really redeployment opportunities. So we've been giving some thought to how we can use our team differently and perhaps make them part of the neighbourhood teams or make them part of the practice teams even, because there's quite a lot of expertise there and extra capacity that I think will be quite useful to practice into neighbourhood teams. So we're investigating the opportunities at the moment. One of the things that's being considered is the clinical pharmacists going into neighbourhood teams next year, and we've sort of mentioned that to the CCG, we think that would be a good idea. Our admin team could provide some help with extended hours in the contact centre, back office shared functions for practices, things like that. So we're looking at any kind of opportunities that we could have around reducing our core costs and sort of making sure that we still are able to provide a service, but by using them in a different way. So, where's that leave us? The future of the Federation is that obviously income from our contracts is declining. It won't sustain the Federation going forward. We've also decided that because you've got Alliance for GPs now representing you from your neighbourhood teams, we don't really have a place in the transformation agenda. So we've been talking to locality teams about where does that leave us, and we feel very much as a federation that we should be there to support practices and to try and build sustainable, resilient primary care, but really be more about core primary care than getting other contracts in the community and working like that. So one of the questions that we want to ask you tonight is whether you would allow us to be your representative on the county-wide primary care contracting group. This is a new group that's going to replace the current primary care commissioning groups and has individual GPs giving their advice. We feel very much that we should be part of the discussions around any new services that are being developed for primary care locally, and we hope that you feel that way too. Really that's about maintaining income into primary care and making sure that the contracts that come out are sensible really, and that they're asking you to deliver things that are achievable. One of the things recently that's come out is the visiting service, the winter visiting service, and we would have liked to have been involved in trying to work that up because we don't think it really hits the mark, and it would have been great if we had an opportunity to sit down with commissioners to try and work out a model that might have worked. So, about 12 months ago, we came around to you all and said that there may be a possibility that we'll come to you and ask you for a subscription in the future. And I think that time's come around again in terms of, we know we're not going to be sustainable on contracting going forward. So really, that's a heads up for the AGM, because those are the kinds of things we'd like you to take back to your practice to discuss with them before we have the meeting at the end of November. So after all that negativity, I just wanted to share with you a couple of exciting developments that's going on in the Federation at the moment. So one of the things that we've been working on for a number of months now is an online pharmacy. So this is like a distance selling pharmacy. This is something that sort of cropped up in the middle of last year. We thought there might be an opportunity for us, not as a federation, but as a separate company, to start delivering online pharmacy. Just because we know that it's quite good in terms of profit. There's a possibility there of it being very profitable for partners. And what we'd anticipate then, if we get the licence, we're going through the licence application process at the moment, is that actually we'd offer it to you as individuals to be partners of. So actually there's a profit-making opportunity and a dividend opportunity for you within that. So that's something that we'll give you more details on as soon as we know about the licence. We didn't want to say too much until we started going through the process, because we don't get the licence, obviously, the whole idea is kaput, but if that comes off, then we'll be coming out to you to see who's interested really in being part of that business. The other thing that we've been looking at is providing a carers agency. So this was something that was brought up by Upton Surgery a few months ago. They struggle to find carers who want to work in sort of rural locations. So there's quite lots of provision in Worcester City, but not so much in sort of more rural localities. So we're currently going through CQC registration to add that as a service to us as a company. We'll start small, but we think that again could provide us with a profitable business. So again, more details on that when we've got through the registration process, but I didn't want to leave you in a situation where it's all doom and gloom. So there's a bit of hope on the horizon there. So any questions about any of that before I hand over to our speakers tonight? Anyway.
You did mention what part of the Timberline contract was making.
Timberline contract, that's incorporated with the community hospitals contract of 60,000.
Did you together 60,000?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, without further ado, I'll go to hand over then. So our first speaker is Ben Gowland. Ben is the founder of Ockham Healthcare. Some of you might subscribe to the podcasts. And Ben's brought with him Robert McCartney, who's a solicitor, who can sometimes help out with some of the legal questions that come up around merger and federations.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for inviting me today to your meeting. I've been asked to talk about the easy topic of the future of federations, so I'll have a go. My background actually is, about 10 years ago, I set up a GP federation in Northamptonshire, in practice-based commissioning days. We had 70 practices, a population of about 650,000, and then CCGs came along, and I became the accounts officer of many CCG. And then, as Claire said recently, you set up Ockham Healthcare, and what I've been doing is working with practices, groups of practices, about how they work together and the different options, and helping them sort of move that forward. As Claire said as well, one of the things we do is we do this weekly podcast where I get to talk to all sorts of interesting people about exciting things that happen in general practice. So at some point in the presentation, I'm going to try and play a clip, a few clips from those. So that's technology dependent, just as a reminder before we start. Okay, so helpfully for this talk as well, some of you will know that Nuffield Trust released a report in the last couple of weeks about collaboration in general practice. And what they did was a survey of GPs and people who work in practices, as well as CCG, clinical chairs and accountable officers, to ask them about So they use this sort of word collaboration as a sort of thing that goes all the way through from a loose network through a federation into a merger, into like a full merger. Okay, so and they were looking at sort of collaborations in general practice, and found some really interesting things. So one thing they found was that 81% of practices are now involved in some form of collaboration, and that's gone up from 73% in the last 2 years. And sort of interesting, I'm not sure how the stats work on this, a quarter of all of those federations were set up in the last year. So maybe sort of failed and a new one started. Also, it turns out some practices are involved in more than one collaboration. Now, I think what we're seeing is definitely a growth in federations and collaboration in recent times. And the reason for that, I think, is twofold. The first reason is because of the crisis that general practice is in. You don't need me to tell you about that, but certainly I'm working in all different parts of the country, and people struggle. It starts with pressure of the workload on individuals, that not being manageable, that leading to problems with recruitment, and in some places, I don't know what it's like locally, but people just aren't able to recruit GPs. Then you get into expensive locums, not enough locums, they can pick and choose where they go. Practices can get into financial difficulties quite quickly. And what we're finding is, whilst the GP Forward View was released a year ago to try and address some of those issues, it isn't having an impact for practices. And given what's in that document, my reading of the funding of that, I can't see that things are going to transform because of that in the next 5 years. So that's one context. The other bit of context that's changing is the NHS itself is changing. So in the system we currently have, you've got commissioners and providers. And so you've got GP-led commissioners, and those commissioners hold contracts with individual providers, and you're just talking about some of those contracts. So that's changing into a new system, which I sort of loosely termed accountable care. So you've got, and it's sort of what's under the STPs. So what is accountable care? So accountable care is essentially a collaboration of providers. General practice is one of those providers. They have a fixed budget for a population, and they're supposed to deliver a set of outcomes for that population. Now, the transition from the old system to the new system isn't delineated because there's no primary legislation. So the government will burn out the Health and Social Care Act. They don't want to introduce a version 2, and so it's kind of happening behind the system, but it's definitely happening. And you'll see that as the CCD gets kind of more distant. So as the context changes, pressure of general practice, the change to the system, what it means is that federations themselves are changing. So historically, so the federations that were set up 10 years ago, they were essentially set up to be able to supposedly bid for all these services that were going to come out of the hospital and deliver these services in the community. And that was the point of a federation. And it was completely separate to the core business of a practice. There's clear blue water between what the federation does and what the practice does. And that was how federations were set up, for the ones that were set up 10 years ago. But the role's changing, and it's changing so that now it takes on, I would say, 3 roles. So yes, it still delivers an extended range of services, and Claire was talking about the range of services that you're delivering here locally. The second thing it's doing is saying we have a really important role in supporting member practices, i.e. practices working together to support each other, to deliver benefits to each other's core business by working together. The interesting thing about the Northfield Trust report is what they found was that collaborations that have been going for longer than 2 years were positively correlated with being able to deliver improvement in practice sustainability. And why might that be? It's because to really impact on core practice sustainability, there needs to be a level of trust between the group of practices that are the federation and the individual practice. Where there's no trust, you're just not going to let people in. Those things stay separate. The third role of federations in the new world is around having a voice in the new models of care. Now, nothing but trust in that survey. Half of GPs felt general practice had not been at all influential in supporting the local STP. And you're stuck in this really difficult place because CCGs can't represent general practice as providers because as CCGs they have a commissioning responsibility for their whole population. LMCs can't represent general practice because other providers won't accept them as a partner. So people see, when I used to work with Acute Trust and Community Trust, they didn't want the LMC around the table, and the reason they didn't is because they saw them as a trade union. So whilst some people might have wanted them to represent them, they couldn't really, and so it leaves practice in this difficult place where no one's representing them as practices. Even federations, if federations are doing things that have nothing to do with core general practice business, how are they representing general practice? Remember, in the new world, there is no commissioner, so there isn't this statutory role for general practice as leaders of the commissioning system. It's just a collaboration of providers. So where's the voice of general practice? And if general practice has got 28 different voices and they're all arguing with each other, it becomes no voice. And the Acute Trust, the Community Trust are the ones that end up having the most powerful voice. So what that means is the role of federation shifts from having this clear blue water between core practice business and then federations delivering separate services to that, to an overlap that starts to exist between what the federation does and the core business of individual practices. Those two things aren't completely separate in the way they've been historically. So the really important piece is, what is that overlap? What's the overlap between the federation and the practice? And this really is kind of the key. So it's saying, what are the potential benefits of practices working together that can deliver a benefit to our business as an individual practice? And the places that have started to really get into this have found, introducing different roles, managing the risk of different roles like pharmacists and paramedics or physiotherapists. I'm sure doing some of this stuff locally, that's better managed at scale than individually. I know that our health partnership talk, they talk about having a single set of accounts instead of 32 sets of accounts, managing CQC, both sharing in practice, but also having OHP a single registration for the CQC. But equally, you can start to have banks of staff for agency and reduce the cost of filling those gaps in practice rotas that are crippling to the businesses of individual practices. I guess the other places as well is increasingly commissioners are saying we're not going to commission services necessarily from individual practices, and we're seeing that with access to start off with. So that the extended access, I know practices didn't want it, but there was no opportunity. It wasn't ever offered as a debt, as a les. You've got the old access debt, but we're talking about the big one, the £3.34 head into the £6 head. That's not offered to individual practices. That's groups of practices. And from the Nuffield report, the biggest thing that federations have actually done in the last 2 years is access. And that's because money is available for it. So I don't think it's going to be a surprise if going forward you start to see increasingly services only being available through that route because this is agenda to try and get some sort of operation at scale. The other thing, of course, that if you have an overlap, that what that does is it enables core practice, so the delivery of core general practice to be part of accountable care. So what you don't want is in sort of collaborative working between organisations, core general practice gets lost. You think of general practice as extra things it can do, the type of list of services that the federation does. It's not just that, is it? More important is the core business that you deliver in general practice every day. Now I'm going to try here to play a clip of, so this is Chris Ash, he's a director at Southern Health, there's an MCP vanguard, and they had experience of directly employing practice actually joined their community trust. And so I was saying, is it better in collaborative working to directly employ the trust, the community trust, or to work with federations? And here's what he said.
We are probably seeing some of our strongest innovation at the moment coming in areas where federations have managed to strengthen and stabilise themselves, often with the support of CCGs. Going back to what we said earlier in the call about is this a preferred way of working? Actually, I think that the strongest platform for innovation is where general practice is able to come together into a federation and work at some scale self-sufficiently, and therefore they come to the table with other partners, community trust, local acute trust, social services, wherever it may be, as an equal and self-sufficient partner.
The interesting thing for me around that is that the rest of the system wants general practice to have a clear voice around the table. They get frustrated because they can't find one that's actually that's going to work. So now you get into a question that says, okay, well, I get that there's a value in this overlap between what the federation does and what my practice does. But what's the right amount of overlap? So if you imagine, if you say all fully merged, so you just became one big practice, that's complete overlap, or you've got just a little bit at the end. So I mean, there's a kind of scale. So I asked, now Rebecca Rose is one of the authors of the Nuffield Trust report that I've been referencing. And a year ago, they produced a different report called Is Bigger Better, which again I would recommend you have a look at when you think about operating at scale. And this was me sort of asking her how much overlap did she think there ought to be.
Should they merge with another practice, or should they potentially form one of these at-scale organisations instead? I just wonder whether you see the two things as different, and what advice you might have for practice faced with that type of dilemma.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and several people have asked it to me. So one thing I would highlight, which is in chapter 4 of our report, the governance arrangements of all of these organisations have changed more than once for most of them. It's not a static thing, and I think if a cluster of practices, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many, merge prematurely, it'll be like it'll run the risk of a bad marriage, and it'll deteriorate. There will be infighting, there won't be the necessary trust. Whilst in one sense it might give you a simpler governance arrangement with more opportunity to push change through, if the merged partners don't trust each other, it is highly likely to fall apart. One could see the networking arrangement as a stepping stone, where you form a network, start working together, get to understand each other better, hopefully build trust in each other, work out the goals that you're going for, test each other's values, and when you've got that confidence that you can work well together and are very likely to work well together, then you could perhaps merge.
There's a really interesting metric around practices working together, whether it's a federation or a merger, which is around trust. So trust is the key metric really for me. And I don't think it's a bilateral choice between, is it a full merger or is it a federation? And there are models that exist in between that. I know we've been talking about a super practice. And, our health partnership is like an in-between model, because individual practices keep their property, they keep their profits, they organise the way they work, but there are certain things that they share. So the point about trust is the more that you can put in, so the bigger you can make that level of overlap, potentially the bigger the benefit that can come. So, for example, our health partnership are finding the biggest benefit is having a single set of accounts. Not just because you go from paying 32 sets of accounting fees to paying, they actually have an in-house accountancy service. But also then, they get to see what makes different practices or profit centres, and you look at it as profitable, and you can actually share that learning between the different practices. But of course, that requires the trust for the individual practice to share an accountant and have a single set of accounts across multiple practices. So you've got this trade-off between how much you're prepared to put in, which will dictate the potential for what return you can get. But if you put too much in, I mean, you'll know places where they've tried to go for a full merger with lots of practices, and if it's done too quickly, it'll fall over, because it's about have you worked through some of those difficult issues. Now, have you actually got a mechanism for dealing with some of those difficult issues as they arrive? As you do change that level of overlap, you do get into a place where you need different governance arrangements, and these guys and Robert are much more expert than me in explaining some of those things. But one of the things that I would say is it's not just the benefits that you can see today. Part of what you're doing is creating a platform for the future. So what is it going to look like in 10 years' time? So if you stay as you are, what will that look like in 10 years' time? And if you do this, what will it look like in 10 years' time? And I spoke to Helen Parker. Helen Parker actually used to work at Modality, some of you might know about. She's gone to New Zealand. In New Zealand, they've had networks of practices, owned by the practices, for nearly 20 years. And they now got to a place where they, as a sort of group, have been able to create a whole new model of what core general practice would look like. Here's Helen just describing that.
Yes, we do. I think that's one of the big advantages of having a GP-owned network that's acting on behalf of its member practices, and it's got some scale, is that we're able to design, develop, test new models of care, new technology, and then offer it up to our member practices.
One of the things they're actually doing now is using some of they create a whole set of income streams. You can continue to do that over time, even though you're working on the core practice business, to be able to then invest in technology to help their sort of member practices. One other point that I wanted to talk about was around independence of general practice and how important is the independence of general practice. And I suspect if I went around the room and asked you, I'd get a range of answers and people would think different things. In that Nuffield Trust report, one of the stats that I found fascinating was that 27% of practices said that they were ready to ditch their core contract and become an associate in a local agreement. So essentially become salaried GPs within a bigger organisation involved the acute trust or the community trust. Now, 52% said they were ready to do it, and about a quarter said they didn't know. But really, I suspect those practices are the ones that get into the biggest difficulties, have the biggest workload pressures, whose lives have become so miserable, they think, well, I just don't want to do it anymore, and so they get to a place where they're just prepared to give it up. Now, federations and working together in whatever governance form you choose can be a mechanism to sustain independence. And I know you've had Mark Newbold here, but one of the things I find really compelling about the Our Health Partnership model is the fact that they view it as a way of protecting the independence of general practice.
I mean, there aren't many at-scale GP organisations that are totally self-sufficient. The way, as you know, the way that the history's gone in the last few years, the majority have had some sort of additional funding to support them, be it Challenge Fund or Vanguard or Commissioner funding. We're trying to set a model up that is self-sustainable. What we are seemingly demonstrating is that the future for general practice can be based on GMS independent practice. That model can work in the way that the wider NHS is transforming. There is no need, for instance, to completely change the way general practice operates and go to, say, an employed model. That might work for some, but you don't have to do it. The current model of general practice is more than capable of moving forward in the direction that I think everybody wants to see.
So I think it's really interesting because, for me, one of the things that people think about when you think about working together and these types of collaborative models is that somehow it's about giving up independence, because there is a bit of giving up that sort of very, very local decision-making. But it seems to me that no one's going to fix the model of general practice. Those problems aren't going to go away. So what is it really going to look like in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? And actually, is it more important to be as individual practices independent from each other? Or is that worth, to an extent, sacrificing to ensure that the model of independent general practice itself can be maintained? So I think it's really important to think about both of those things together. So just to summarise then from me, I think when we think about the future of federations, I think the really important piece is that the context has changed. So there's the crisis in general practice, the move to accountable care, and then the role of federations is, as well as delivering this range of services in the community, it's also around supporting the sustainability of general practice and around having a voice within accountable care. There isn't a mandated path for general practice to follow, because it isn't in primary legislation. So really, it's up to general practice to track and chart that path for itself. This issue of how big is that overlap between the federation and the individual practices is key. And the more the trust that exists, and it's more likely to exist in a place like this where you've been working together for a number of years, the bigger the overlap can be and the bigger the potential benefit could be. And that in itself can be a mechanism to preserve the independence of general practice. What it does mean is that the governance models potentially need to adapt because of the changing role of the federation. So I don't think this whole model of a company limited by shares with maybe a few individuals being their shareholder is one that's sustainable for the role that federations have going into the future. That's it from me. I think we'll hand back to Claire.
Very much. Thank you. Ben's going to join us for a Q&A session at the end, so if you don't mind, we'll just go on with the presentations and then we'll just have questions at the end. So I need to introduce now Martin Massey and Steve Cosford. They work for McIntyre Hudson Accountants in Birmingham, but they used to work for Grant Thornton, who were the accountants who did the OHP merger. So I thought we'd get them along to explain how that went, their view on the merger process.
Good evening, everyone. As Claire said, I'm Martin Ramsey. This is my colleague Steve Cosford. Thank you for inviting us along tonight. We've got only a fairly short slot, so when we do these things, we typically talk for about an hour. So we're going to try and do that in 15 minutes. So we will be skipping through at a bit of pace. So here we are. We're a national firm of chartered accountants in what's called the mid-tier. We're very active in the healthcare sector as one of our key investment sectors as a firm, and Steve and I spend a significant proportion of our time working purely primary care. We go around the country talking to groups about at-scale solutions, and our flagship transaction that we worked on was the Our Health Partnership merger, which actually lots of people are talking about that model now. When we started on that journey 3 years ago, it was highly innovative and highly risky, so those guys have actually taken some of those steps, I think, that the rest of you in the room can potentially benefit from. We've got lots of other transactions as well around the country. We also network with lots of other professionals in the sector and work closely with Hempsons as well. Right, so we've just, Claire gave us a little bit of background information about you, just so we wanted to get a feel for you as a group. So I think out of the 32 practices, 18 of you are at the table having a discussion at this stage. I know there's varying degrees of appetite between those of you in the room. When we add you together, we have 71 partners, 174,000 patients, a range of practice sizes there. No huge practices, obviously the list size varies, but there's nothing that stands out as unwieldy compared to the others. You're all GMS, which is potentially helpful. 7 dispensing practices, and I know there's been some concern about dispensing practices and VAT, which is an issue we've come across before, and Steve's going to cover that later on. I think we do have a solution for you to that problem. And I think out of my sort of Google Earth search kind of identified that I think 3 pairs of you were already co-located in the same premises. As an accountant, I still don't understand co-location, but that's just me as a businessman rather than as a healthcare professional, but again, for another day. I've mapped you there as well, so I think when I did the Google Maps distance, there's 20 miles between the northernmost and the southernmost practice, which is not dissimilar to the Eye Health Partnerships. If you think about Birmingham with Sutton Coldfield to the very north and Barn Green down to the south, you know, theirs is a fairly large patch as well. But obviously you've got a couple of smaller clusters in there. And one of the things we'll come on to talk about in a minute is fit between practices. Right, so that's the background. We normally talk through this slide quite a lot, but I think that's already been covered really. I think probably the one I would flag above all the others that people talk to us about the most is work-life balance, in terms of something that they would like as an outcome of an at-scale solution. I think time and again we hear that partners are increasingly struggling, particularly the admin side of their business, and I think most of you probably would prefer to spend more time in clinical work and less time following paper around. Interesting to hear what Ben had to say actually, because the point further down that list is the NHS drive towards practice at scale. I was reading a document yesterday which was a tender document that CCG in London had put out, and very much in that document it was clear that the only people who were able to tender for that piece of work was an at-scale provider, and they went a bit further than just saying it has to be an at-scale provider. They were specifying in terms of organisational collaboration at a level that led me to think they really wanted more than just a loose arrangement between practices, so I think I was talking to somebody earlier about at some point in time, do the powers that be start to use the big boot to force you into certain models? Well, I don't know the answer to that. Okay, so I won't linger too much on that slide. Right, what alternatives are open to you? I know you've got to the point where you're considering the Eye Health Partnership model. I think you should always keep in your minds that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and I think one of the challenges you've got as a group is this is quite a big thing to do, and you're doctors, you're not accountants or lawyers. Across the country, there is no one single preferred route that is settled as that's the way you do it. So if you want to go at scale, there's the route. Different groups are doing different things in different areas, and different advisors are saying different things. So it's quite a big decision for you to make. You have to trust not only your colleagues, but also the professionals that are around you. There are lots of options. We do particularly like the Eye Health model, particularly because of its flexibility, and it's a merger, but a light touch merger. So, in terms of shifting sands and what will the landscape look like in 10 years' time? Well, the OHP model kind of gives you more flexibility to change over time with the landscape, whereas if you went down the traditional, let's just merge everything together, stick it in one pot, share our profits, share our properties, share our end numbers, one, that's difficult to get out. So once you're in it, and that's it, pretty much. So we do quite like that model. I'm not going to talk through all of these, we've got 15 minutes. I can go through more detail if anybody wants to later. In terms of outcomes, there's lots on the list there that we've come up with. Cost efficiency is one, and Steve's going to cover that in more detail later. We've got a slide on that. Revenue growth, people talk about a lot. I'm always fairly sceptical about revenue growth. My personal view is you don't predicate a merger on new contracts unless there's something tangible that you can hang your hat on. Some people are very lucky, they've got a CCG that will actually say, if you do this, you get that. Great, if that's there. Otherwise, it's an upside that you keep to the side. The work-life balance improvement, we have seen evidence of that. So we were talking to a group in the London Borough a couple of weeks ago where what they were able to do is say, well, look at how much we're spending on locums across all the practices that are emerging. How many salaried GPs could we afford for that same spend? And actually, wouldn't it be better to have, I think in that example we said you could have 3 salaried GPs and save broadly £100,000 on what you're spending at the moment, and the number of sessions that those 3 salaried GPs were going to cover, and the flexibility that would give you of having full-time people on the payroll was really going to help. And that was something they really liked. So I think that's something that is a potential. Really helps smaller practices, I think, much more than the larger practices in the network. Protecting the future of primary care, I mean, you just covered that, and I think that's really important. The strength of your voice as a collective, again, Ben covered that. Certainly, I don't know whether, was it Mark Newbold that came to see you from our health partnership, or Vish, I don't know who came down, but certainly Vish is the chairman, he's the GP lead of our health partnership. He's now at the beck and call of Simon Stevens. He's on all sorts of committees nationally. So he's not only driving the local healthcare agenda across Birmingham, he's also involved in setting the national healthcare agenda. And I think that for them, that was probably one of the most important outcomes, that they are now leading. So they're coming up with a plan, not having it done to them. Recruitment and retention of partners, I mean, that doesn't just happen, you have to work at it. I think we've certainly seen some examples around the country where a structure, an at-scale structure, has been more attractive to trainees, particularly where groups have formed good links with local universities and made that work. I guess it's also easier to plan longer-term succession if you're operating as a coordinated group. Flexible workforce, I think I've covered. Patient outcomes, I'm not qualified to talk about. People have told me that's a benefit. I wouldn't presume to really talk about that in detail. There's lots of things to think about in terms of who should merge together and do they fit. I think the top one is probably one of the most important for me. If you actually decide to merge, you are in a partnership together. Whilst you might have local autonomy and you might do the OHP model, you are still in a partnership together. So you've got to get on with the people that are in that partnership. I think the point about falling out and things on the audio clip, that's important. Don't go into a merger with somebody that you frankly can't stand. I don't think that's a good basis for any business. There's lots of other things on that list in terms of fit of practice. I'm not going to go through them all individually, but I think for me the key difference is if you decided to go down a true merger route, these are all really important things that you have to get right, particularly things like the profits and the property. It's very difficult to merge a group of this size, 18 practices. It's very difficult to do a true merger because you can have massive winners and losers across the group. It's hugely difficult to achieve, and that trust point is, you're probably not going to achieve it. The benefit of our health partnership model is you do have that autonomy. So some of these things don't matter quite so much. Does it matter if one practice earns more than the other if you're keeping your local profits? Well, probably not. I think you want to set up some parameters though. If there's practices that are massively underperforming, there needs to be a plan in place to resolve that issue. I don't think I want to be in business with somebody that really can't pay the bills. At the other end of the spectrum, if you've got highly performing practices, well, let's share that best practice. Things like get your QOF achievement up, make sure you're all leveraging enhanced services as much as you can. I think those are important things that you can benefit from. So, just to remind you that these are the key features of the OHP model. One partnership, and people sometimes don't grasp that point. It is one partnership. So, whilst you are still autonomous and local, you are in one legal structure. It doesn't always feel like it. I think some of the OHP practices might say, but you are in something together. Separate local profit centres, so broadly you have a separate set of accounts for your bit. It's a profit centre, a division, if you like. and then there's one set of accounts for the whole. And obviously there's a head office function as well that they've got, particularly because they've got staff employed at the centre of the organisation. On a smaller scale, you're going to have to do less of that. And one of the things I was talking to somebody about earlier is you've got to be really careful that you don't put a central team in place that just is an incremental cost and basically dilutes everybody's profit. That's something you need to do some careful planning around. So local autonomy and decision making, but within a corridor, you can't go and employ 10 new partners tomorrow without talking to your fellow practices. But broadly, you can run your own location how you see fit. A partner elected board, OHB, only GPs are on the overall governing organisation. There's no employed executives. So employees like Mark Newbold sit underneath the doctors in the pecking order, which I think is important. They've got centralised accounting and payroll, a central locum bank, which I think is working well for them. And as I said, the strength of voice is something that's coming across really strongly. That they've looked at this, I think, again, I've got quite a lot in common with what Ben was saying, actually. Stolen a lot of my thunder tonight. They've got separate M numbers, but there is, I think, a long-term aim to have locality clusters, perhaps. So already in the north of the region, 5 of their surgeries in Sutton Coldfield have got together to form one profit centre. So they've done a mini merger within a merger, which is getting a bit bizarre, really. But I think that they see that as the way forward. And that was all about the trust building. On day one, they didn't feel ready to do that. 2 years in, they actually thought, yeah, we can see how that could work. And they all practices with similar features, same leafy suburb, similar levels of profit. They've been able to bridge that trust gap and merge together. Right, so I think I'm overrunning slightly. So the things that we've learned from the other mergers we've done. Strong project management is essential right from the start. Now, whether that is somebody like Claire, an external consultant, whether it's you as GPs, these things don't just happen, they've got to be driven. So you've got to have some people at the centre of this who really want to make it happen and going to work hard at it, and it is quite hard work. You've got to have a really clear project plan and work out who's going to do what and when, and assign responsibilities. Again, it might seem like it's a bit of paper that you sign and then you're all in this thing. Within that, there are loads of separate tasks that have to be achieved. And some of them are quite small things, some of them are big things, but there's a lot of them. It doesn't just happen. A business plan, in my mind, is absolutely critical. So I think there's this misconception that merging businesses together means you make more profit. It doesn't. If you merge businesses together, you make less profit because it costs you money to merge businesses together. So your starting point is you put 2 and 2 together and you get 3.75, not 4. So in order to make 2 and 2 equal 5, you've got to do something. So you've got to take some actions. Now, some of that is going to be cost rationalisation, which Steve will talk about. And there might be some difficult decisions to make along the way. Some of it you might decide there's some property rationalisation to do. Whatever it is, if you're going to actually, if property is part of this for you, you've got to have a clear plan and then you've got to follow through on it. And it's that follow through that often starts to drift. So if there's a difficult decision around admin staff, that there could be some rationalisation to save money. You guys as a group are very empathetic. You don't find dealing with those staff issues very easy. You're not harsh, hard-nosed businessmen. And often that sort of thing then slips. So you plan to make extra profit, and everybody talks about it, and then it doesn't happen. So getting that buy-in from everybody to really deliver. If that is, that might not be part of the plan, but if that is part of the plan, you have to make sure you follow through. Just be realistic on timing. These things take, don't say we're going to do this in 3 months. You really need to be on a bit of a journey. Certainly 6 months, I'd say, is the minimum. Possibly longer would be healthy to work through everything. Involve practice managers. I think one of the things the mistake we made with OHP was we didn't really involve the practice managers until the merger happened. Then we went, oh my God, there's loads of stuff locally that's got to be dealt with now, and nobody knew what was going on, and we wish we brought them on the journey with us. I think engaging with individual practices we found was really important, so we did drop-in sessions, so it gives people a chance to ask those difficult questions one-on-one rather than in front of a group like this, which, you know, I think that avoids people having that nagging doubt in their mind that then over time gnaws away at them and then they decide, well, we're not going to do it. So that was really helpful. Am I on the wrong side? Okay. Another mistake we made with OHP was the whole thinking around the centralisation of the back office didn't really start till the merger happened. We did it too quickly, we rushed at it with hindsight and did the merger and then thought, right, we're going to have to do something now with the back office. So it took another year before they got the team in place, went through a couple of interims before they got an actual good quality FD involved. And then we started finding the practice was saying, okay, you promised us this and you haven't delivered it, so you know, you're behind the plan. So what I would advise is during the merger process, you're actually putting your plans in place for that centralisation, if you want centralisation to happen straight away when the merger occurs. Not an OHP thing, but across the country, property is a huge issue, and I suspect Ian will perhaps touch on property in a while, so I won't linger on that, but you know, huge decision really for you, is property in, out, how do you structure it? One that Steve and I dealt with, they just did sale and leasebacks and all of them, they said this is too difficult, let's just get rid of all the properties, cash in on our gains, we'll just all have lease properties, it makes life easier. The partnership need is critical, and again, Ian will talk through this, but you need good quality lawyers like Hempsons, and I'm not just saying that because Ian's here. Hempsons are one of the leading firms nationally, and we've worked with them many times, and it is really important to get the detail right in that deed. Your local high street solicitor cannot do this properly. And I think the final one is, I think this has already been dealt with today. You've got some financial support now, I think, in the CCG, which is great. Huge difference between locations. Some get great support, some get none. So, is it 60p a patient? Yeah, which probably above average, I would say, across the country. They're getting stingier as time goes on, so well done. Okay, I'll now hand over to Steve.
Thank you. Starting to think now about some of the profit opportunities that you might have if you are going to go into some sort of a larger scale merger. Local costs have already been touched on, but increasingly when we look at our benchmarking figures for the practice that we act for, locals are forming a higher and higher proportion of those costs. So anything that you can do to try and save or reduce those has got to be a bonus. And then you've got other things thrown at you like IR35 legislation for using locals for companies, etc. So as a bigger organisation, you've got more flexibility as to how you can approach that. Large number of GP clients of mine are looking to retire or retire early or reduce their sessions. And there's still, on the whole, quite a gap between what you will earn as a profit as a partner and what you'll pay a salaried doctor, even when you add on the employment cost of employees' national insurance, employees' pension. That gap has been shortening in recent years, but on the whole, most of my clients, there is still a big enough gap to make it worthwhile being a partner. As a bigger organisation, you don't necessarily need the same number of partners to actually run the business. And therefore, it is an opportunity when you've got people that leave to start replacing them with salaried doctors, or actually look at how you structure the workflow. So some of my higher earning clients are now got fewer GP, certainly fewer GP partners, looking to take on more nurse practitioners, clinical pharmacists have been used, I've mentioned as well. So you can look at the whole workforce and how you structure the different levels of services that GPs do themselves to try and increase profitability. Most people laugh when we say this, but the next thing is external accountancy costs. Accountants often lose out when people come together and reduce fees. And that is true. Generally, the accountancy fee will be lower. There's only one partnership tax return, although it's a much bigger one. There'll still be the same level of individual partner tax returns, personal ones, unless the partner number reduces. But there's some substantial savings that can be made. Just have to caveat that a bit, because it's a bigger organisation, you'll need to have a better and more sophisticated internal accounting function, so you're probably going to have to employ better qualified staff to do your accounts internally, But it does mean that you wouldn't necessarily need someone in each site to be able to do that. You can have your own central accounts team. And certainly that's how OHP have moved to now. And although there is one set of partnership accounts, in order to work on an autonomy profit centre basis, each location still has to be capable of having its own set of accounts, which are now being done internally there. Practice admin staff costs, this can be a bit of a touchy one, because nobody likes to mention the redundancy word, and in most cases that can be avoided, but it is an opportunity to look at where the skill mix lies within your staff in each individual practice. So are some better deployed elsewhere? If someone's got part of an accounting function, would it be better if that was their whole role rather than part of it? But we've already mentioned there are some surgeries where, or some practices where you're sharing locations. One merger that we looked at recently had 3 practices, relatively small ones, all in the same building, so 3 sets of reception staff, 3 practice managers, and obviously coming together, they didn't need that level. In a lot of cases, people were redeployed or through natural wastage, people leaving, then redundancies were avoided, but it is a genuine saving that can be made. Increased buying power. As a bigger organisation, you've got a lot of buying power. It's from the big savings that have come through on things like indemnity subscriptions and massive reductions we're seeing come through, but it is also an opportunity to look at some of your other suppliers, whether they're drug suppliers, etc., to see whether you can negotiate a bit better deal as a bigger organisation. We've also seen some QOF improvements. So part of what we've done is an initial feasibility study review of the accounts of the practices involved, looking at where there are differences in QOF performance and why some practices achieve a much higher level of QOF points than others. What can they do to share amongst the group to try and bring everybody up to the same level? There is of course a risk if all contracts come together and actually all QOF is averaged over the patch that could bring some down, but often that's only seen as a very short-term thing. The aim is to bring everybody up to the same level. There's also an opportunity within the hard servicing, particularly where you've got different skill mixes at different practices. So one GP can provide a particular service at one practice that others haven't, or you can start thinking about can you work across locations, share those skills in order to bring up the income across the whole patch. And mentioned new contracts there. Again, Martin said that if you've got something which you know is definite, is on the table and it's going to be a genuine additional source of income, then all well and good. But really, you've got to think of it as a potential and not an achieved from the start. Talking about some of the risks now, you would be one partnership. If you come together as a super partnership, you are one partnership. And so, in theory, you are all jointly and several liable. And I know that's a big concern for a lot of people. But there are ways of sort of mitigating that, and you can have different layers within your own internal organisation, depending on how your agreements are written, depending on corporate governance, etc. So there's a lot of concerns around that area that can be addressed with the correct legal documentation and structure. I believe Ian might touch on that a bit as well, so I won't go into it in detail. One of the other risks is the abort risk, is if you go down this process so far, you clock up a lot of costs, and what if somebody then pulls out? Or even if you do merge, it goes ahead and 6 months, 12 months, 2 years down the line, somebody wants to pull out. So therefore you've got to have the right procedures in place to allow for that, but you've also got to have the right documents in place to make sure that actually they bear their fair share of the cost in doing so. I know that with OHP, there was one practice 6 months down the line thought they could just simply walk away, carry on as before. You can come out of it, but it's not as simple as that. So it is a big step going into this, and you've got to be fully aware of what you're signing up to. Ability to exit, and also looking at M numbers. Martin mentioned 2 main types of merger. One is what we call the true merger, which is on day one. Basically, you pool the profits, all property comes in, you all share in that. And then you've got the autonomy route where actually you maintain individual profit centres. Certainly for a period of time, although in most cases there should be some sort of plan somewhere down the line to try and bring people onto a more even footing. Now, if you go in as one altogether and on day one you've got a complete new contract for everybody, that's a bit difficult to come out of, which is why a lot of people prefer to keep their individual M numbers, certainly for a while. And that does make it easier to get out if you want to, although as I said, that's not an easy option still. You've still got a lot of work that needs to be done to be able to do that. Profit disputes, that's more looking at where there are different levels of profitability between different practices. I suppose one of the most extreme ones we looked at recently where a full-time partner in one practice was earning close to $250,000, and in another one that was part of the discussions, the highest earning full-time GP was about £80,000. And that's a massive difference to be able to overcome, particularly if you were going to pull profits from day one. And I don't think you'd ever be able to fully bridge that gap. So there is a structure in place whereby the aim is to bring the profits up of the lower performing ones, but that high earning practice, there was a particular reason or particular reasons why they were earning so much. So some of that income's been ring-fenced because it's a service that they do that nobody else does. Property's already mentioned, so I'm not going to go on to that into too much detail. One of the bigger concerns is also where you've got a rogue partner or a rogue practice and how that could impact on everybody. But again, if you've got the right legal structure, the right governance in place, one, you'd hope to be able to identify that right from the start or early on, and therefore you'd have the procedures in place as to how you deal with that, which would minimise the risk for anybody else. So quality legal agreement is key. Most of the mergers we've been involved with have gone through successfully. One or two have failed, one of them within a week of merger date. And that's largely because there weren't proper legal agreements in place, nobody knew what would happen if things didn't work out. We were particularly concerned because we still had fees that needed to be paid, and therefore, had there been a proper agreement in place, and that would have covered whose responsibility would that lie with. Due diligence. What we would call full due diligence is rarely done. It's a very expensive exercise where we look at accounts, various bits and pieces. But some sort of feasibility study, we would always recommend that should be done. And that's what we've done for a number of mergers we're involved with, where we do a fairly high-level look at the accounts in quite a bit of detail, compare against our benchmarking figures across all the practices we earn, that we act for, and look to see whether there are differences between practice and profitability, and what's the reason for those. Is there a particular reason? Is it something you can easily address? So at least going into it, you've got a better understanding of what your colleagues will be like and what the earning potential is. Tax is obviously an important consideration as well. I've already mentioned that you'd be one partnership, you'd have one partnership tax return, but it would be a lot more complicated than previously. Possibly one of the biggest tax issues is on the next point. Just a quick show of hands, are there any non-March year-end practices in the room that would be taking place? And of those practices, are you aware of overlap relief, overlap profits, and how that impacts you when you leave or retire, or if you cease, merge, or change your year-end accounting date? And for some, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I could spend 15 minutes just talking about this particular issue. It's just being aware that if you were to change your year-end, or if you were deemed to have ceased, then you would crystallise overlap profits, which could result in a higher inflated profits in the year of merger. And for many practices, that is an absolute barrier to join because the figure is too high. You'll always have to pay the tax when you leave, retire anyway, but it brings that forward. So that's something we've looked at very closely. And in those cases, we've always liaised with HM Revenue and Customs. We've come up with a plan as to what we're doing and why. We've got clearance from the revenue in advance so that they agree to what we're doing. And also changing the year end for the new practice is an important part of this. And we've seen ones which other accountants have done where effectively everyone's just ceased and started a completely new business on the next day, and they've suddenly been hit with these high tax bills that they weren't expecting. As I said, there is a way around that. We've done this a number of times now, so it is important that everyone's aware of the issue and aware of what we need to do in order to avoid that. Depending on what you do with property, then there could be capital gains tax or stamp duty land tax issues, so Ian may touch on that as well. And then just employment taxes, looking at your staff, looking at contracts of employment, how you manage the payroll, terms and conditions, another important area to look at. VAT, I understand there are 7 dispensing practices that are considering this, and VAT on any big scale merger is always an issue whether you've got dispensing practices or not, because all of you will have income in your accounts that are potentially VATable, just that it's such a small figure that you've never had to consider VAT registration. If you've got 18 practices that are coming together, even if you didn't have any dispensers in there is a chance that that element of income would exceed the current VAT registration threshold, which is £85,000, so you would have to register for VAT. The fact that you've got dispensing practices included would mean that even if there was only one of them, automatically everybody would have to register for VAT. certain items you would then have to start charging VAT on. It does mean that there's certain elements of your expenditure VAT that you could start to claim back, although it would be a relatively small proportion. But this is where there then becomes a concern with dispensing practices because of how they claim back input VAT at the moment. So as a dispensing practice, then part of your business is VATable, even though it's zero rated, so that's your dispensing element. What that does, it allows you to claim back all of the input VAT on dispensing related costs and a proportion of the VAT on all of your general overheads. And that proportion on the overheads is based on a proportion of your VATable income compared to your total income. If you become a bigger practice, then that VATable income gets diluted as a proportion of your total income because you've got all the practices in there but they've got very little VATable income as well. So if you were to look at the practice as a whole, your VAT partial exemption percentage could reduce significantly, which means that actually you would then lose out because you wouldn't be able to claim back as much input VAT as you had done previously. And the reason I'm spending a bit of time talking about this is for some of you it's potentially a big issue. Where we've seen this done before, and we've had discussions with HM Revenue and Customs about that, they have allowed the new practice, the new merged partnership, to effectively split the practices into two sections. So you've got one which is dispensing and the other's non-dispensing, and therefore being able to maintain the dispensing partial exemption percentages that you had previously and not lose VAT. Now, I appreciate that for some of you that probably doesn't mean an awful lot, but if you're a dispensing practice, it can mean quite a significant amount. So there are steps that you have to go through. It does involve getting the appropriate clearance from Revenue and Customs about that. If you thought that was a potential issue, then it's certainly something we can mitigate any risk of that to a large degree. Okay, so that's it on our part. I'll hand over to Ian now, and then any questions at the end we'll have to answer.
Even the year after they were set up, and for many it's a process of evolution for them.
Might need some technical help here.
Okay.
Cancel it. Can you cancel it?
So I was saying, we've been involved with sort of at least setting up at least 70 GP provider organisations in the last couple of years, and there are lessons to learn from those. And the first thing is, and someone's already mentioned, that on day one, the way you set yourself up on day one is not cast in stone. And a partnership is a very flexible model, and with lots of organisations in collaborations, there's always evolution. You can find in a year's time, for very valid reasons, you change, you tweak your governance. So you don't need to worry about it's fixed in stone. And the other thing, you might think as a lawyer, I'm all for form. And that's the first thing which should be on the table. It isn't. We've had a federation next door come to us and say, oh, the federation next door, here are their articles, we want to be that when we set up our federation. I said, no, you don't. You've got to understand why you want that. So you need to understand your objectives, the way you want to work together, and then you decide what form is going to work best for you. You've got to own the ideas behind the way you work together. And that is so important in the, and I'm going to go through the process, when you're setting yourself up, that you've all got to understand why you're doing it that way. Because where we've seen things derail is when it comes to signature, people that start murmuring start. And then people say, I didn't realise it was going to work that way, or it was going to mean that to me, personally, or for my practice. So you have to be brought on, and I'm going to talk about process and how we help you to understand as you go through the process. Because when you sign, you should be able to go out on the street. I know lots of this is confidential, but if it wasn't, you should be able to go out on the street and explain to someone immediately, this is why we're doing it, this is how it will work, this is how it will benefit the patients. So what I'm going to do, because like you only spent at least an hour on this, So I've got about 15 minutes, so I'm actually going to go right to the end. But don't worry, I'm going to go back on some of it. But what I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about first steps in process, but before I do that, I want to look at some of the key issues. Some of these we've already covered, and you said trust. And I think trust is absolutely essential for any form of GPs working at scale. And particularly trust comes into play around sort of in the OHP model, how much autonomy do we trust individual practices to have, and how much do we entrust the management board, the partnership board, whatever you call it, to do on our behalf. And I know it's a very different model from a GP practice, a partnership, where the owners are the decision makers. You really have to understand the way trust works, because without trust, GPs working at scale, that is one of the reasons we see some of them fail. The trust isn't there. So we would help you understand what the structure and how the structure could engender that trust. Talked about cost. Premises, that can be one of the most complicated areas to deal with, and often what it means is for timing that you might think it's a cop-out, but in or out, as you said, often at the beginning, for large-scale super partnerships, the premises are left out, and that is something you are going to deal with later. Because to have a premises management plan is a big exercise in itself. Also, if you leave premises out, you've heard about flexibility. What happens if practice wants to exit? Very difficult to practice to exit if the asset, the key asset of that practice is owned by the super partnership. Lots of things we could talk about on premises, but if you want to leave it premises out, and if they're leasehold premises, you are still going to have to probably go to the landlord and get some form of consent, because at the very least, the super partnership is occupying those premises. They are not mentioned on the lease. So you are going to have to do something with premises, but it might be lighter touch than transferring all the freeholds and leaseholds into the super partnership. You said that's maybe something. You should have a plan, but you will have to develop that plan. That's going to be work in progress, probably for the scale you're talking about. A merger of contracts. Again, it's essential, and I don't know to what level at stage you are talking to the local team of NHS England, but NHS England do take different approaches. We've heard about it could be a single contract awarded to the super partnership, but again, if people say, well, do we want flexibility? Maybe we want the ability to exit. It's very, very difficult to exit if there's only one contract held by the super partnership. So what sometimes happens is that all the existing, say, GMS contracts of 20 practices, you keep 20 contracts, those 20 GMS contracts, but you have the partners of the super partnership, some or all of them, go on that contract. It's something you need to discuss with NHS England. If you have a lot of partners in your super partnership, for every partner to go on that contract gets a bit difficult. But you want to get to the point where it's treated as all partners of the super partnership on that contract, because you want to be able to access NHS pensions. So one of the key things you want to do is be confident that when you go into the super partnership, you have the same access to the NHS pensions which you currently do in your individual practices. So you need to ensure that the super partnership is an employing authority. And one of the key things you need to check there is who's employing the staff. Is the employer of the staff, which would be the super partnership, is that the contract holder of, let's say, the 20 GMS contracts? So that's something we can help you through, and maybe we talk to NHS England, the Pensions Agency, to sort those things out. Taxation, I'm staying well clear of that, and you've already mentioned that. Continuation of dispensing rights. again, the key thing is that dispensing practices, or the rest of you want to know that those dispensing rights are not going to be lost by amalgamation. In the NHS pharmaceutical regulations, Part 8 deals with amalgamation of practices. We need to look at the detail in your context, but we've advised other super partnerships, and there has been no issue about dispensing rights, that the current premises approval, which a dispensing practice have, are treated as having transferred to the super partnership. That is possible under those provisions, but we'd obviously need to look at the detail for yourselves. So if any of you are thinking that could be a barrier, hopefully it wouldn't be a barrier for you, because there's a process in the regulations which is intended to allow it. Profit share, you've already heard about that. Liability, yes, this is as a super partnership, the super partnership or the partners of the super partnership are jointly and severally liable for all liabilities which arise anywhere in the super partnership in any of the practices. So if we've got the OHP model, you have the constituent practices with their contracts, they're responsible for running those contracts, incurring the costs, and for the profits derived from that cost centre. But something could happen in the practice which creates a liability for which there's joint and several liability. So I don't know how you view that. But the advantage of a super partnership is you have far more resources to deal with risk. Every business has a risk. So with the extra resources available to a super partnership, you have the opportunity to identify risk, put resources into systems to control risk, to manage risk. And you can also provide central support. That central support may be a great way of minimising risk. So you do what every business does about identifying and managing risk. And this brings me on to something which I think is not enough emphasis is put on it in any form of collaboration at scale amongst GPs. Often it becomes insistent that we need to get to the finishing line. And so the most obvious structure is willing GPs who are prepared to serve on the board. That gets you over the starting line. We've had examples recently where this was a federation where the CCG wanted to make it the lead contractor for a very large contract. It would actually be subcontracted to an acute trust. That was the intention. But when the Commissioner looked at the governance of this federation, it felt it was so weak that it was not going to award a large-scale contract to that federation. And I emphasise that strong governance, that's one of the best ways of managing risk, but it's a much more positive thing. It's how you get the most benefit out of your organisation. And it's almost, lots of organisations look at what do we need to be an effective board, because that is what strong governance is about. As GPs, you own your own businesses, your first thoughts, how can we make sure that this board is GP owned? That's the most important thing. I've heard talk about elections to boards. How do you know that all of the people who are elected have got the necessary skills to be an effective board? There's something you need to think about. The ways of doing it, you can have a small nominations committee. You work out what skills you need for the current circumstances, and then you can vet people who come along who are nominated, and then they go for election. The OHP model, you've heard there's the board, and then you have the management team underneath. Some people might think of, should we integrate some of the management team, chief executive, onto the main board, so the chief executive shares the risk of decision making with the GPs. What happens if you feel, yeah, hand on heart, we don't think we actually have all the skills we need amongst ourselves? Should you have the ability, only a minority, but have a couple of seats reserved on the board to bring other people in from outside the practices? We've seen some of the larger federations evolve into doing that, because the most important thing for them, if they had a skilled board, they were able to deliver more for the practices. So I would really emphasise focusing on governance, because it will deal with so many issues and help you in so many different ways. We talked about liabilities being acquired, that's down to due diligence. I'm going to talk about process in a moment. TUPE, this is, you may all know about TUPE, but this is essentially all your practice staff will transfer under their existing terms and conditions of employment to the super partnership. That automatically happens under law. It's called TUPE. And you can't avoid it. It's what happened as a duty for the transferring practices to consult with staff. Once all staff are transferred in, you may then have a project. Do we need to integrate terms and conditions? Do we have staff, lots of staff working lots of different terms and conditions? That may be something you need to look at. One thing up there, one thing not up there is, heard about exit. I don't know if it's important for you to also focus on exit. What happens if someone wants to leave? You may say no one should be allowed to leave within a certain period of startup. But if someone does want to leave, what are the consequences for you? What are the consequences for them? You obviously, as you would in your partnership deed, would limit the number of partners who can retire over a certain period, so you're not left with all the liabilities. If you are serious about allowing exit, you need flexibility. I've mentioned, where do the premises sit? Are you going to have a single contract, or try and retain, certainly for an interim period, the GMS or PMS contracts of the current practices? So that's something we can help you work through so that it's actually workable. So what I want to do for my, I don't know what my last few minutes means, but whatever they are, I just want to go back to first steps. Let's skip the top, but just go down to the last 2 bullet points. So this is how we would help in the process. So first steps, you obviously need some initial commitment from the practices. And one of the first things practices should do, and I don't know how far you are with a sort of interim, I don't know if it's a partnership board or shadow board, whatever you call it, it doesn't matter. But when you're dealing at scale, this is your first opportunity to entrust. You've got to have a small group of people who start taking this forward. So how are you going to appoint an interim partnership board? These are not going to be necessarily people who are going to be the first members of the board when you set up a super partnership. Just call it a project group or steering group, if that makes you feel more comfortable. What are their terms of reference? What can they deal with? The process. You've heard about due diligence, the financial due diligence. Not going to talk about that. We would get involved in the legal due diligence. We provide it, the way we suggest we do it, we provide a checklist. Each practice fills it in. The idea is it's got to be proportionate, so we're only looking for significant risks, material issues. We would then produce a report, let's say, call it the interim partnership board, for them to look at. So you look at yourselves. Are there any serious issues of which we're aware lurking there? Localities I'm going to skip because I just want to focus on the process. You've heard that strong documents are essential in this, so I've put up on the slide the key legal documents. So I'm assuming all of you have partnership agreements. If you don't, if any of you are partnerships at will, I would suggest that you should have a partnership agreement before this happens, and I'll explain why in a moment. But there'll be an overarching super partnership agreement for the new partnership. And one of the things that will deal with is the governance. How much autonomy do the practices have? for running their contract? What is the partnership board going to look like? What decisions can it take without having to go back to the practices? What decisions are reserved for all the partners collectively? Each practice will have to sign a merger agreement. It will be the same form for all practices. Under that, the practice agrees to transfer its assets, its contract. It will refer to the TUPE transfer of staff. And we would suggest that the partners of each practice give some basic warranties, because you will have handed over due diligence information, and the rest of you will want to know that that information you provided was accurate and up to date, because the rest of you are relying on it. And the other key thing a merger agreement will do is will say the super partnership is only going to be responsible for liabilities arising from day one of the super partnership. Unless it agrees to take over any liabilities of practices, liabilities of the practices pre-transfer belong to the practices. They've got to meet those liabilities. Constituent practice operating agreement. That is essentially the partnership deed I'm assuming all the practices have. The way it works in OHP is that those current partnership deeds of a practice stay in place, but they're no longer a partnership deed, it's just a contractual way of working. So the super partnership says you as a practice can continue operating under the way you thought worked best for you, which is your own practice operating agreement, i.e. your current partnership deed. There's certain bits of it which will be excluded from applying, but essentially you have the opportunity to continue working in the way you know and the way you think works best for you. That is the autonomy model for practices. If you don't have a partnership deed, then you will need to put one in place. Invitation document. This is the formal document which goes out to the practice saying, these are the documents, this is what you need to sign to join up to become a super partnership. I've mentioned TUPE. You will need to consult with all your employees. TUPE only applies to employees, so we will provide you with guidance notes on the type of things you need to cover in your consultation, and we can give you scripts as well. So we can produce those documents, but what's going to happen to those documents? We won't get anywhere if immediately all the documents get circulated to 18, 20 practices. The idea is you have this project board who have some authority to start developing the draft documents, or else we'll never get to the starting line. I said at the beginning it is absolutely essential that sooner rather than later you understand. That list of documents doesn't really tell you much about how it's going to look for you, how it's going to feel for you. So practice engagement events, not to take you through documents line by line, but to take you through the principles behind them. And so you can then say, yes, I understand that, or I'm not sure that would work, or everything comes out in the open very early on. So we can be involved, help you run those. That's what we've done with others. You've had your practice engagement, there's feedback come back, maybe to your project board. We're getting to the position where documents are treated as agreed. You might then have an event to actually issue the documents so you actually feel we're owning this now. This is us, rather than just getting documents sent around to the practices, all come together, sign documents. But what we might do, and we've done again, I think it happened with OHP, was there might be drop-in sessions for practices. That's your final opportunity to make sure you understand. Because what none of you will be grateful for is within a couple of weeks of going live, people start saying, no, it doesn't work that way. You don't want to be derailed by people not understanding the structure you set up. So it's absolutely essential, everyone understands, that's how it's going to work from day one, and then you can get on with your practices. So there may be some drop-in sessions where if practices don't understand something, on a one-to-one basis we can take them through what it's going to look like. There'll be a return date for signed documents, and then your interim board would decide that is the day we're going to go live. That's what the process could look like, very simplified, but it won't work unless you have the opportunity to be involved. So when you sign, you feel, I understand everything in there, I own it now, I'm proud to be part of it. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Do you want to come and sit at the front now? You can take some questions. Anybody got a question?
Yeah, you talked about integrating, initially keeping contracts separate, but talked about a move to integrating contracts over time. You heard about OHP, who have a few practices within the model have decided to integrate their contracts and form a sort of merger within a merger. Where would that leave dispensing practices in a sort of where you became a contract that was integrated? That would be problematic, I suspect.
If they then want to sort of spin out.
No, you talk about the contracts which are being held separately within the thing. You talk about a move towards integrating those contracts.
I think that's quite a big cultural shift, because once you start doing that, you are saying we will accept now that exit.
But you sort of implied that was a move that would happen over time.
It could do, but you
don't have to.
You don't have to.
No, and OHP haven't got any plans to formally merge contracts, I suspect. But unless little groups of practices think we could all work better as one cost centre, then they could do that, and that would be a merger of their individual contracts together. Is that right?
Yes, it is. It's where you use the term merger within a merger, so it's still one super partnership, but 5 come together as one contract rather than one NHS GMS contract instead of 5 separate ones. So,
but a dispensing practice actually merging its contract with a practice that wasn't dispensing would be problematic for maintaining its dispensing.
I think
No, not necessarily, because and this is what we'd have to look at, but the regulations treat that one of the scenarios they look at is a dispensing practice might be merging with a practice which isn't a dispensing practice. Dispensing practice could merge between themselves, but it may not necessarily. It's probably more likely that they don't. So dispensing practice merges with other practices, none of which has a dispensing practice. There is allowance in the regulations for that premises approval for the dispensing practice to be protected. But you've got to go through the regulations and fit it into a scenario and then just see if you tick all the boxes.
Taking a step back on all of that regulatory stuff, I think when OHP happened 3 years ago, we were picking up the phone to agencies and saying, okay, we're going to do this. How does that work for you? So I personally phoned the pensions agency, and they just said, no idea. Nobody's ever done it before. And broadly, everybody was very cooperative, and I think they got the outcomes they needed from all of the agencies. I think we found since that people have been learning from those experiences. The problems are more at CCG level, because you're reliant on that CCG having some experience on their patch, whereas obviously the other agencies have national exposure. But we have found that generally all the agencies have been very accommodating, because the direction of travel is in line with the desired outcome on NHSE. So it's in everybody's interest to make it work. But the important thing is asking before you do anything and getting written clearance, written confirmation before you jump. Don't ever do it and then check afterwards, because that's where you're in a world of pain.
Will there some real processes stands for looking for the practices, their risks? Because you'll be joining hands with other practices. You want to know how much risk you will be taking. So what is the process for that, and where does it stand in the...
Can I just start and you give it? I mean, as I said, our involvement would be to answer that question. Is the legal due diligence we would do, it would ask various questions, and the point of those questions is to identify not every risk, but significant risk. So that questionnaire goes to the same questionnaire goes to every practice. Practices fill that in, it comes back to us, or it comes back to your interim partnership board, and they compile a report based on the information provided, and the purpose of that report is to highlight significant risk, so that that should all be open and available and shared with all other practices. So that's part of the process, an important part of the process.
And I think that's part of it to do with any risk at the start, and then there's also the issue of what could happen after day one if something comes to light after that date that started after that date, and that's where within the overall partnership agreement, super partnership agreement, and your individual site agreements, spelling out who's responsible for what, and therefore trying to limit or restrict any liability if it does relate to a specific site. There's an overall partnership, then the ultimate, all parties joining separate liability could apply. As long as there are the funds and assets within a particular location, then it is possible to limit to that to some degree. The other thing that we normally suggest, I think as we mentioned earlier, is what we call it a feasibility study. It's almost like a light due diligence exercise. So typically what we do is collect the annual accounts for the last 3 years for all the practices that we're interested in. Then we go through and interrogate those accounts. So we're looking for things like overdrawn capital and current accounts, bank borrowings that don't relate purely to the practice premises, other liabilities that are sitting in those numbers. We look at them compared to our benchmarking, so we're looking at practices that are outliers, whether that's in terms of income streams, costs, balance sheet items, which are the practices that are unusual. Then we might poke a little bit harder at those areas that we don't really understand and ask some follow-up questions. So we normally suggest that's the first stage. So before you even get into the detailed, spending a lot of money, you've at least got a good idea of the features of the other businesses that are in the pot, and actually, do I want to merge with them? We normally do that first stage. Typically we keep it anonymous, because that normally happens before people have really 100% committed. So we would normally report back on using charts and things to show all the population, but they're sort of coded. And then once everybody has got comfortable, it's then important, I think, that you all share with each other, because if you're not willing to share at that stage, well, you shouldn't be merging with one another in the first place. Does that help?
Can I just add that post the merger, everything is going to be protected pre-merger with the legal documentation, getting that right. Post the merger, this is where the governance structures are really important in the new entity. You've got to have that shared board and shared structures where you can identify the problems and you can react to them. Decent operational planning for what the services are going to look like and how they're going to operate moving forward will really help that in advance. Because you can start preempting where some of those risks might arise that are post-event, as it were.
Can I just say, I've seen a number of situations like this where people get to, okay, should we do something like this together? And because it moves really quickly into what the governance form is, and then this sort of real focus on risks, the thing can collapse quite quickly. And so the places that have been more successful, what they do is they go, what problem are we trying to solve? And be really clear about that. What benefits are we trying to generate? And then what risks are there associated with that? And look at that in the red. Because you're not looking at risks in isolation. You're looking at what will this achieve, what benefits will it deliver, and what are the risks of it? And you've got to be able to balance the two in order to progress.
I've always been worried about the risks of this, and you talked about some of the financial risks, but the big risks to us as GPs being in partnerships with people who are effectively total strangers, and not whether somebody's been filling the books or not, how they've been treating their staff for 30 years and how they continue to do so. There's been lots of stuff in the press in the last week about that, and there's, the impacts of the new Solihull. Those are the real risks to us, because if one of the partnerships, older partnerships, the Joyous Super Partnership is doing something funny with its finances, that's going to get uncovered fairly easily. But it's those much bigger issues, much rarer, but much huger risks. And you said, one of your dominoes slides that you could have bought that risk. I'm fascinated to hear how you could have bought that risk. I don't understand that. And we are jointly and separately liable, and we were all talking about being able to limit that within each sub-partnership or operating centre. How?
Yeah, well, an element of that is within the partnership or the site operating agreement. So where we say taking your existing partnership agreements, that's how you work as a principle. Part of it will identify what each site is responsible for, and therefore that site having responsibility for any cost implications of that.
Any cost implications, even if that partnership
Well,
is
no,
completely out of
that's where I
access?
said it can only be limited to agree. So while that site is effectively solvent on its own, I know it's still part of the partnership, and it can cover those costs, then that's where those costs come.
So in the event
But ultimately, in a disaster situation where they took on some liability that they as individuals at a location couldn't cover, then yes, you would still be, in theory, jointly civil liability as a bigger practice. Part of having the correct governance and procedures in place would be you hope that you'd be able to identify any potential problems at an earlier stage. I think then you can come on to sort of individual liability, whereas if an individual takes on or signs up to some sort of contract which they haven't got the authority to do so, then there's a potential that they personally can be a risk. But again, obviously they've got to have the personal assets to be able to do that.
The partnership is liable, individuals within the partnership are liable. I mean, all of that is true,
Ultimately,
but once they've lost their house and their pension scheme, which are quite small chunks of money compared to some of the things that we've been hearing about recently, the partners in that partnership are going to be liable, aren't they?
in the ultimate disaster situation, then yes, and that's where part of it is on the legal provisions, part of it is on the governance and procedures, trying to minimise that risk and being able to identify that there is a potential problem early on. But yeah, you can never fully mitigate it.
And we still can't be in LLP.
No, you can't. An LLP can't hold a GMS contract or FEMA's contract at the moment.
No, you can't be an employing authority to access the NHS pensions, so no, unfortunately not.
A contrast I would probably give you is, if you look at other types of professionals, so I'm hoping to join partnership in our firm in the very near future. I'll have,
You're an LLP.
we are an LLP, but if I lost my capital and my job and my current account and I still had a tax liability, I'd be bankrupt. So it is an LLP, but one thing I always say to groups is limited liability status isn't all it's cracked up to be, because your whole life is embedded in that business. So when you look at the legal practices that have gone bust, or accounting practices that have gone bust, the partners are, even though there's limited liability structures, those partners are in a world of pain when that business goes bust. Just because of the limitation of liability doesn't mean you walk away and you're scot-free. So ultimately there is a protection there for the absolutely catastrophic issues, but bear in mind it's only to a level.
I mean, I'm a partner of Firm Solicitors, we're not an LLP. So this idea of risk, the way it's all about managing risk, we have very clear authorities as to who can do what. It's all well monitored. We have checks, double checks and things about how liabilities can be incurred. We manage it.
How many sites do you work on?
We have 4 sites.
See, I think one of the things, I'm really interested that you're a partnership and not an LLP.
So it's
doable. Potentially with 32 sites. And so I don't know how you do the governance for things like sexual harassment. How do you do that governance across 32 sites on a week by week, month by month basis? If you're on 4 sites and you've got an HR director on each of those 4 sites, you've got somebody there whose job is to do that. But we're so spread out with so many partners. It seems to be more risky.
But it could be happening in any practice
of knowing that, and if it's happening 15 miles away in practice, you don't set foot in from one year's end to the next.
But you have to have confidence that they would act in the way that you would act. That's all about trusting it, isn't it? So, if we're going to constantly keep them back to the same conversation about sort of risk, then there's probably no point in moving any further forward. We've got people who are trying to get beyond that.
It's about how we can mitigate that risk. It's about how we can mitigate that risk.
Yeah, it's trying to work
that risk is there, it's about how we can mitigate.
I think Claire's right, you'd expect anybody in any practice to notice those things happening, and the staff would follow the correct reporting procedures. All of you will have procedures in place. Obviously, if the staff don't report it, then nobody's going to understand that it's happening. But if it was reported, then the overall governance structure would deal with that, probably in a more efficient way than an individual practice would, because you've got the HR expertise.
So I think it's a good challenge, and I think one of the things you would have to do as a group is, if individuals or individual practices have got concerns like that, it's about putting those on the table early. If you form a steering group, for want of a better phrase, get those issues on the table early and work out, well, actually, we've identified there's a concern here. Can we mitigate that? Is there anything we can do about it? So, if I was advising one of my clients, I'd say, well, okay, how about a partnership-wide anonymous submission structure, so any employee at any location can submit a concern to somebody at the centre, no matter what, even bypassing the local partners. That might be something you think about. You might have an employee satisfaction type survey, whether that's anonymous or not. That might be practice-wide, and you need some strong governance around it, but there might be something you can do there. But it's all about putting all of those concerns into the top of the hopper, sitting around the table, working out, well, what can we do about them, or is there anything we can do about them? Actually, I suspect there'll be at least one or two practices in this room that get to the point where they say, I just can't get comfortable. There is something in there that I just can't live with, where the others can, and you will all draw the line at a slightly different place. Each of you's got your own cut-off, but you must get them on the table and talk about them.
And an important part of that is there is CQC and the CQC assurance framework that if it's applied rightly with the well-governed, well-led elements of it, it should pick up those parts, it should govern those bits. Those bits are often the bits that are difficult to implement in smaller practices, because they are often seen as red tape heavy, but actually when you're operating at scale, you can implement them better and have those better flows of information with performance of the team.
In terms of due diligence, you're talking about financial due diligence. I have to agree that the risk is not on the finances. Where I've seen practices fail elsewhere, they've been solvent, there's been money available, but they can't recruit. They've developed, for whatever reason, some reputational difficulties. People, they start having a difficulty, they know there's a place to work where it's very hard to work. As soon as they lose another person, it's even harder, and then on a downward spiral. And I think that is quite different, I would expect, because of the workforce we've got and the type of work we do and the GP population, the difficulty in recruitment to start with. We're not in the same sort of world you're in terms of law and accountancy and everything else. So what due diligence process is planned for looking at, you might think, the softer side? It's about working patterns. It's about what is the place like to work there? What is the trust within the partnership like? What is the working arrangement for the staff? How do you make sure that people want to work there? So what is planned in terms of that type of due diligence, which I think is miles more important than the financial, which I think in the practices I've seen fail, the finances have been not an issue.
Ben and I often refer to this as the hearts and minds part of the process. So we've got all the technical bits and formalities, and you can ask all the questions to get answers and to write reports. But you're right, if you don't have the hearts and minds of everybody following you along and being able to actually understand, are we working in the right way? Do we get along? Can we develop ways of working that resolve these issues? It's not going to succeed. Merging just to merge with no plan for the issues, going back to what Ben said earlier, what other GPs are trying to tackle. It's just following the process without actually developing it.
That's what I'm saying. So what is the plan for the due diligence component to look at the non-financial issues which affect viability?
I would say that's down to the project board to decide what they want to do, because as I said, there's no silver bullet solution to that sort of question. Some groups have gone ahead without doing any of that. Some have actually done quite a lot and really wanted to get to know each other very well before they joined. And I don't think there's a one side. I don't think you can actually say there isn't a plan. I think as of today, there isn't a plan. It's for you as a group to work out what do we need to do to get ourselves comfortable. I mean, I'm the bean counter, so I know one of the things they've done at OHP is now they've got a centralised accounting system. They monitor practices, numbers monthly. So if there are small trends, they can pick them up very early. And the idea is, if there's an issue emerging, you don't wait until you've got a failing practice. You address it early on. Now, it might not come out in the numbers if it is some sort of ethical or harassment or whatever it might be. If you're just being horrible to your staff, that's not going to necessarily come out in the numbers. And it might come out in the churn on your payroll of starters and leavers and that sort of thing. Why is that practice getting through receptionists at a rate of 5 a year, whereas nobody else is? So there might be some indicators, but I think you probably need to sit down as a group and think, well, I don't know how well you know each other already, actually, as a group of practitioners.
Yeah, I guess it's fair to see, well, that some of them we've looked at, certain practices have been specifically excluded from being allowed to take part, even though they've been in the same area, the same patch, because of certain issues that everyone else is aware of. So, it's not sort of an open invitation. You don't have, just because you're doing it together doesn't mean you have to include every single practice within a certain area. If you don't want them in as a collective, you don't have to.
But who decides it would go to an upside scheme? Or would the board decide, because then everyone still would be comfortable? It's still one group making a decision and everyone else might be thinking, hang on a minute, I don't agree, I'm dealing with that.
Well, the board can't, this interim board can't force any practice to sign up to this. So the interim board can keep things moving, but the final decision is an individual decision of each practice, whether you're satisfied with everything you've heard and you want to sign up. If I can just go back to legal due diligence, the staff, not the softer things you mentioned, but the legal due diligence will always have a section on the staff. So the history of staff claims, staff grievances, that is all questioned. Now you might say, what happens if they don't declare? One of this is, it can't be tested externally, it's down to self-declaration. You've got to come back to trust. That's why each practice, if they join, are asked to warrant that they haven't withheld any key information when they were sent that questionnaire. If they have, one of the consequences you might be part expel them. So some of the staff issues are addressed in legal due diligence. But whenever we do legal due diligence, we have to discuss with, let's say, the project board, what do you want us to cover? What do you think are the main risks? We talk through this, because it's got to be proportionate. If you ever seen a private sector takeover, the due diligence questionnaire will go on for 200 pages. Well, you're never going to get off the ground with that. So it's got to be very direct and targeted as to what are the key issues which you need to address. But I accept there may be some very much softer things which you have to find out a way to get to grips with.
Can I just say 2 points back to Simon and the comments as well? The Wyre Forest Health Partnership, obviously, that are just over the road literally from us, from their merged entity, when they have had a site that has been difficult with recruitment and things, they have actually been able to transfer partners from the other site into those other sites, because believe it or not, they have found that some sites have been partner heavy at times. Now you may all laugh at that, but we've all got emerging salaried doctors. Some of the better practices amongst us, if you want to call it that, have got people that they can't naturally progress up to partnerships for whatever reasons. And I think we have got the skill mix and the workforce amongst all of the practices to actually help each other out and to look at things. And some of it has been actually that the process has not been quite right in that practice, but the partners are so bogged down in the middle of actually just delivering the service that if you send somebody else in on a secondment for 6 or 12 months, it just gives that headspace and that breathing space of extra clinical support to say, well, let's look at how we're delivering it and let's look at the appointment system and things like that. So I think there are advantages like that as well as disadvantages with it. And I think the other thing for us as a federation so far is that when we've really wanted to support a practice and we've really wanted to go out and help, we've not been allowed to because of the mechanisms with the contracting and the finances and how things flow. And I think that's great if you're not a practice that's struggling, but we always say that everybody is one partner away from being a struggling practice. So actually I think even if you're not a struggling practice now, you never quite knew when you could be one, and that you need the support of this structure and the board and things to come in and help and have the shared resources and the shared expertise that we've got and that is developing as an organisation with it. So I suppose it depends whether you're a glass half empty or you're a half glass full, aren't you, type of person of what this merger suits you and where you go with it all. But I think there was always the pros and the cons of it all. And I think it's easy to focus on all the negatives of all this because this is what gives us all the anxiety, but then we all forget about the benefits and why we're actually trying to do it and what we want to achieve with it.
Just one thing to add to that as well is, whatever number of practices join from the start, that's not so going to stay at that. You've always got practices within the you may have some you've got some concern about it, so actually you're not probably going to join from day one. These are our concerns, and basically you can address those in the next 6 to 12 months, and you can join at a later date. No 1-2 partnership where they've actually approached, having already formed, been established, approached poor performing practices because they see potential to turn them around and generate more profits out of them with the correct structure, with the correct staffing in place. So sometimes you can actually turn it into an opportunity. It's just being aware of what you're actually taking on the staff and then having a plan as to how you get it to the right place.
So that's the whole point, is that the questions of due diligence are so important to be specific to this group. But this the situation where reputationally you can't employ. And if we ask the right questions, and what you're saying is that actually that's an opportunity for those practices to turn things around with the right support procedure.
Yeah, and that doesn't necessarily mean you've got to take them on board from day one. If they're actually wishing to fulfill these particular criteria, then we can have a talk about actually joining. But you can actually be working alongside of it in that period to help them get to where they need to be to become part of it.
Can I just pick up on this lady's question around who decides who should be in and out? I think I'd be deficient as a business advisor if I didn't say to you, you should not merge with anybody you are not comfortable with at the start. This isn't like a federation where it's a separate thing and you're all a member of it. This is, you are in one business together, so you do have to be comfortable. It isn't a free-for-all. It isn't, okay, anybody can sign up and join if they want to. You have got to be comfortable with the practices that you're merging with, and part of that is about the professionals, assessing those businesses, but part of it is about you as a group being comfortable with each other. So it isn't, there will need to be a board, and so there will need to be a decision-making process in place, and part of that will be, okay, we as a practice have concerns about, if you do have concerns about this practice over here, and we want to discuss that, we want to understand it, and actually that might be a barrier to us joining. It needs to be aired.
That's a different view from the view that we were originally talking about from the Federation, which was that anybody of the 32 wants to join as well. That's a very different view. And I know the OHP model was very much a small group of practices got together and decided how they wanted to do things, and they invited other practices who they thought were like-minded to join them. That wasn't the model that we've been talking about for last year, which is that anybody of the 32 on the patch as well. So that's a real kind of philosophical difference.
You've got to wrestle with it. I wouldn't.
And we need to know which of those two models we're talking about. That does come back down to trust and risk. But that isn't what we've been talking about. We've been talking about any of the 32 that want to join and join.
There are some there are some practices who are considered to be failing, whether that's because they can't recruit or they're financially unstable, whatever. But, part of the reason that we want to do this is to stay in primary care and tackle Worcestershire. So to me personally, it's important that we support those practices, whether that comes out as being the way that everybody else wants to deal with a merger. It's not my decision to make, but I would just want to make that point really, that part of this is to help sustain the core general practice.
That's where you might be looking at phased parts, so not everybody from day one would join and
place to start is why you're doing it in the first place. Just spend ages on it, because it gets difficult in the who can be part of it, or what does the governance look like, or what does the due diligence look like. And it only works if you're really, really clear on why you're doing it. What problem are we trying to solve? When that's clear, you can keep going back to it and go, is it solving the problem? Is it doing what we want it to do? But if you miss that step and don't spend enough time on that step, you just get lost in the other stuff.
I think we've also found, certainly some of the ones that Claire and I have been working on recently, is this is a really important discussion between your own partners as well. You know, it's this, you can't miss that step. We, for example, were talking to a practice a couple of months back, which we had three partners in the room. Two of them were telling us how wonderful everything is, and couldn't foresee any problems arising, and the third one just nodded along. We were contacted shortly afterwards, as we knew we would be, because the third one said, that's not the case. My two partners are both in their mid and late 60s, and I'm in my early 40s. There is a problem coming, they just don't see it because they're getting ready to retire. You know, so you've got to make certain that you have your individual ideas of you as partners, 71 partners, I think that's on the slide, know what you want. You as partnerships know where you're going and what the issues are, and then you collectively understand this from how you can help each other along to form the new primary care.
I think it's fair to say.
Can I just ask about the super practice, what involvement they have if, say, a partner in one of the local practices wants to retire or move for other reasons? Obviously, having a salary GP as a partner would be financially better for the super practice. Would there be any pressure on that individual practice to be employing a salary GP rather than a partner? And would, whoever comes into that practice, do you have to be vetted by the super practice as far as their risk goes?
I think that this comes out of the autonomy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what you agree to.
So in Birmingham, they are allowed to make their own decisions in that respect. So there's one practice that didn't join. They dropped out right at the 11th hour. And that was probably one of their biggest concerns, because they were a group of people who had social purpose as their primary reason for being in practice. They didn't earn very much money. They were in the most deprived area of Birmingham, and it was a very honourable group of people, but that they thought, actually, we want to carry on doing what we're doing for different reasons to everybody else. It's not about profit or anything else. And they decided it wasn't for them. I think what we've seen post-merger is practices have been allowed to make their own decisions. So actually, if you would rather have a GP equity partner rather than a salaried, and that might mean you make slightly less profit each per partner, that's your choice. There's no, in the Birmingham example, there's no pressure to do one or the other. I think what they would like, and what I think probably they could have done more of as business people, is talk to one another before making some of those decisions about resource sharing. So, things like, there's been examples where practice managers have left, rather than thinking, well, what is the right solution? In my locality, is it just like-for-like replacement, or could we do something more creative with resources to get a better outcome? Probably hasn't been as much of that as they would have liked, because they've just been all making their own local decisions.
I think where there are particular issues between the overarching through partnership agreement, you have a defined list of stepping lines where the board would be able to actually step in and take control in certain very specific situations that it was sort of fundamentally detrimental to the practice and the partnership as a whole. I'm not saying that would necessarily be one of those situations, but we want some sort of defined list so that if there was something that one practice was doing which everybody else really didn't feel comfortable with and it was against what you were trying to do as a collective business, there would be some form of stepping right to address that.
I mean, you need to get the balance right between what this autonomy means. So what decisions can they take, what decisions are reserved for the board. And you may change your approach. In a year's time, you either may be less cautious or more cautious, or allow more autonomy, or realise that certain decisions do have an implication for the rest of you. You really need to work out how you're prepared to start on this. What autonomy you're prepared to give, where decisions should lie in the organisation. You may trial it for a year. So this is the best we can do for the moment. This is how we envisage it working, but we accept that in a year's time, and some organisations write in that they're going to review certain aspects of their governance in a year's time. But this is the best we can do at the moment as to how we envisage it works.
Yeah, I know there was talk about equity partners retiring and being replaced with salaried doctors. That's certainly not the way I see it. I think Ben's talked about independence of general practice, independent contractor status. That needs partners, and we're all getting older. And if all the partners just get older and just replace with salaried, we're just going to be left with a whole load of salaried doctors, which is what we think we're trying to avoid doing by doing this whole thing. It's retaining the independence of general practice, and I think there's a huge opportunity here as a larger merged organisation. We talked about a locum bank. We're all, lots of us, training practices. We've got lots of new GP trainees that are becoming GPs, and I think we should be encouraging to be partners. Ben putting on an event. You put on an event, didn't you, to encourage trainees to become partners. Now I think we've got a great opportunity to do this, and that might be through employing them as salaried doctors who come off being a GP trainee, offering jobs for a contract for a couple of years, cutting their teeth within the organisation. But that might lead to a partnership, and that's what I'd love to see.
I think that's part of
we've got to have succession planning in this as well.
Yeah, and
I think it's a huge opportunity for us.
I think increasingly the mutual assessment period is a salary period now, rather than automatic profit, but parity, progression to parity. The property issue for a lot of people can be a barrier to new partner recruitment, which is why some prefer to go salary. And that's where you can then look at this as a bigger picture thing. How do you offer it? Do you recruit, get people through the door initially? Is it better to offer a salary position but with a plan 1, 2, 3 years to offer partnership, whether they want it or not? But at least then you've got that as a career plan to work towards.
When it comes to workforce day, this is an opportunity to explore new models. So it may not be clear now, it may not be clear in a year, 2 years, 3 years' time, in all honesty, what the ideal workforce model is. But this is an opportunity when you're working at this scale that you can try new things. Every practice probably has a different attitude towards different skill mixes, how patients are managed and how different conditions are dealt with. But when you're working at scale, you can really trial it better because you're spreading the risk and you've got the resources that you can implement. So I fully agree. The partnership model is something that Ben and I are passionate about. That's why we have done work with trainees to try and encourage them to stay partners, mostly because it has that ownership and it is that link to your community, to your serving, far better than any other form. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same number of partners as you've got now, maybe more, maybe less. Not sure, but that's where you need to use this as an opportunity to develop your workforce and really plan for that.
Just a question about the property. A lot of practices do own the properties, but they've got mortgages. From your experience from OHP, how the banks have reacted to that mortgages? Have they allowed those partnerships to merge?
So they left their property outside effectively, so that the property owning partners of each location still own their properties, and the mortgages have stayed just as they were beforehand. So so there was no permission needed from the banks because nothing actually changed in respect to those properties.
The mortgages are in partnership name.
They're in the names of the individuals. So as far as the bank's concerned, partnerships aren't a legal entity. So the mortgages are in the name. There's no partnership name on the mortgage. It's the names of sort of 4 partners. Let's say up to 4 partners who hold the legal title. So as far as the bank's concerned, they've got 4 individuals who are still on the mortgage.
No, it just remortgage, it's not true. It's in the partnership name now. Just remortgage in the partnership.
Yeah. Partnerships are not the legal entities. So the people who are legally responsible for the mortgage liabilities are the individual partners.
Some practices have limited companies and the property name.
Yeah, well, that's different. That's different. Yeah.
So that's
that's outside the partnership?
I think probably the other, we interviewed banks for OHP, we did a beauty parade and got most of the main banks along. Lloyds won that beauty parade, and I think it's fair to say their appetite to either remortgage or service those property liabilities was very strong. They were really keen, and we've had Assura recently talking to us as well. You know, they're really keen. I think they're seeing super partnerships as a threat and an opportunity. So, you know, when the innovation comes along, they risk losing market share. So they're willing to do some good deals to maintain market share. So I think that, you know, there is something to think about. Probably longer term. I wouldn't say it's on your early agenda, but there might be something to think about there longer term.
Just mentioned earlier, really briefly, about having secured some CCG funding. Have you any updates at all as to how much this is likely to cost us?
Yes, we think we've got some estimated quotations from McLaren and from Hempson's, and we're looking at around £70,000 to £80,000. So that's basically what we've bid for from the transformation funds, and that's been approved. Which is why we've said that anybody who's already expressed an interest in merger, their second 60p transformation fund has basically been allocated for that purpose. So obviously if you don't want to go ahead, if you decide not to commit to this, then you can go and do something else with that money, but for the time being that's just been ring-fenced to pay for the professional fees.
And you're not, because initially it was about £2 a patient.
That was a subscription, so we talked about the way that OHP have a subscription model of £2 per patient per year, and that covers their running costs and their accountancy fees basically. So that's completely separate, that's just a normal running cost. This is around the professional fees to get up and running in the first place.
The OHP did charge £2 a patient to do the merger, and then it was £2 a patient. So that was paid up in 2 tranches in the year running up to the merger date. So you didn't really get anything for that other than the merger, and then going forward the levy is £2 per patient per year after that. But it sounds like your initial £2 is being funded, which is great. They didn't have that benefit.
Yeah, we want to get practices to the point where you know everything with no cost to yourselves to then say it's not for me. We don't want you to have to put money up front to then become part of the process to then back out of it. And I know it is using your 60p transformation money, and I was particularly a bit sad about that at one point, thinking I'd like to spend that money on doing something else. And then Andy actually reminded me it's only April when the next £1.50 kicks in. So we're only a couple of months away from that now really, and by the time you've decided anything as a locality or a network, got it up and running and got planning permission and everything else from the CCG that you need, you probably will be coming to April anyway, so you could actually just start to plan your next tranche of money to have it from April to do whatever you want with, if that's the way you want to spend this 60p.
But that said, we do need some firm commitment from people now. So because we've got the funding allocated and the CCG want to spend that money, they can't have it still sitting there at the end of the year. We are getting to the point now where we're going to have to set a deadline for you to say that you're definitely wanting to take this further. So all that means is that you're committing your 60p to engaging with these two companies to start the due diligence process. It doesn't mean to say that you have to complete the merger, but it just means that that money is going to be invested in the process.
Can I just ask you what's the alternative? So what's happening to the federation? So this, say 18 of us say, yeah, we're going to take this further. What's happening to the other 14 practices?
The plans for the federation remains in place, subject to funding, and hopefully that the purpose of the federation will be to support and sustain all 32 practices still. So obviously those practices who want to merge will sort of form their own entity, but the federation will still be available across the board to support.
Because you were talking about the possibility of a levy for members of the federation. So obviously if you're still in the federation and there's a levy and then you've got those costs, that needs to be thought out.
Yeah, we haven't got that far, sorry.
Part of that comes down to the strategic planning as to what are these different entities for. The Federation currently, as I understand it, is providing these I kind of liken it to external and internal functions. The external functions are those elements which are contracts you've won, CCG contracts and money loans. The internal functions are those which are core primary care, things that benefit practices and actually are primary care services. If the Federation is providing those large scale services, the merged practice will be providing core GP services at a scale. So there is a separate role, potentially, if that's how you define the strategy of the two entities. One way that is particularly beneficial is if there are higher risk contracts that CCG is commissioning, the Federation may be more comfortable holding that than super partnership. I've seen that happen in other cases.
That's what we discussed about Farrier House surgery. It's a loss-making contract, and it wasn't the one that we wanted to pull into the partnership. So
it's a great example, because you wouldn't want to be running a service of that nature as a super partnership where you personally are affected, but you don't mind running it through a federation where you can support it still.
It's worth mentioning the annual levy within a super partnership is normally where they centralise costs, so they're being incurred through the centre and things like that, whether it's some sort of negotiated indemnity, subscriptions, so therefore that levy is effectively a contribution towards costs which you no longer have to pay for an individual location. So it's not necessarily an additional cost or what we're currently incurring.
So we're talking about how to do that.
Events, I mean, presumably if you were working for the partnership and the federation, you would have to undertake, be paying from those different entities.
Yes, although obviously there'd be a process to go through. So if you were going to have a centralised team in the merged partnership, there'd be a recruitment process to go through. So nothing is set in stone. It's down to the partnership to agree what that looks like and who's going to work for you. Conscious of the time now, so can we just have one more, James?
Just talking about the liabilities again, going back to a super partnership which has done due diligence but finds that there are one or more practices that for whatever reason ill health, retirement, can't recruit. If you've got failing practices, what would be the financial and the manpower, medical and administrative implications to the super partnership? Would we all have to find some money to pay the mortgage of the practices that are or if property isn't, failing, or if property isn't in it, would we have to provide partners or salary doctors to go in and see the patients? What will happen?
Well, I think if we take Royal Forest as an example, obviously they're a fully merged practice, but they are utilising their workforce to go and support practices where they can't recruit. But there is a cost charge for that, as you would expect, any practice to be paying for their own service. If a practice wasn't financially viable in the first place, then we would hope we'd pick that up through governance and we'd do something about it. And that might be a conversation with the CCG about, the services that it provides, the income that it receives. It might be looking at their cost base, so their premises, their staff, lots of things like that.
With respect to that, you have those conversations with the CCG about Farrier House.
We do view Farrier House slightly differently to partnerships, I have to say. It's an APMS contract.
So one of the opportunities really is better utilisation of staff across locations, particularly where you've got different skills mix or shortages at a point in time. And so to cover that, you would have some sort of internal recharging system. So if you're providing GP support or nurse support to a practice who's short for a period of time, then you'd expect to be compensated that, from that practice. So as I said, you'd have some sort of internal recharging system for that. You wouldn't just do it for the ability you have.
Just to give you one example from Birmingham, quite early on there was a practice, there were 6 partners, there were 2 retirements which were expected, which was already going to put the other 4 under quite a lot of pressure. And then there was a sequence of events with ill health, and there was another reason, and I can't remember the other reason, that it went from 6 to 2 in the period of a few months. Now those 2 were, it was distressed. Those 2 didn't know which way to turn. The hours they were working were ridiculous. They were working so hard, they hadn't got time to go recruit, which became a real problem. So how OHP dealt with that is, they asked me to do a review of the accounts and actually say where are things going wrong. Well, it was fairly obvious they were spending a fortune on locums. The ops person from OHP then went in and worked with them, so helped them with the recruitment process, helped them to stabilise the practice, basically. So it was that central support that it was a severe downtick in the business, but then there was some resource redeployed to bring it back onto an even keel again. So I think that was one of the advantages. And I think there's some of the practices that probably really benefit the most are the smaller ones in this. I mean, if you're probably a 6 or 7 partner practice, typically you're more resilient. If you're a single-hander or a 2-partner practice, you are at a lot more risk at the moment. So I think certainly for the smaller ones, the collective brings greater strength, assuming there is some resource at the centre that's competent to go and help out in those situations.
I think that's one of the important things with the autonomy, is not thinking that you're just basically doing exactly the same as you've always done, but just with a different brand name. Part of it is actually trying to work together, sharing resource, sharing best practice, all those sort of things, with that collective responsibility.
This will change over time, and it is something that a recurring theme really is that this is the period where you're thinking this is a huge change, but actually the change, if it's done right, is over many, many years. It should be that the next generation that come up behind you don't see multiple different practices. They see one service, one partnership, and actually it's in everybody's interest to pull together and support each aspect of that. That is a change process that people need to go through during these types of stages. But it's about getting a clear idea of what that vision is going to be like and what steps are to get there.
Okay, so can I draw to a close at that point, please? So, as I mentioned, we will need a sort of a firm commitment from you, and I think we'd really like to see that before the end of November. So if I can give you the 30th of November as a deadline for that, so that we can start the ball rolling, we'd be really grateful for you to go back and discuss that with your teams. James has taken a video of tonight again, so we will send a link out for that, so anybody who couldn't attend tonight can watch back if they want to, if they're interested to. So just really